This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 835 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I'm not sure if I've said it on the podcast before, but Late Round Fantasy Football is on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel by heading to youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. I'll be doing more and more video content as Late Round Fantasy Football grows, so make sure that you're subscribed now so you don't miss it. That's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. It's a 10 Trends episode. Let's get to it. Now, I know everyone's sick and tired of Tony Pollard. I get it. You heard me say to draft him this year, and you even heard me say to buy him last week, and he didn't come through. I'm totally fine with taking the Pollard L this year. I'm not going to get everything right. But I'm not sure people realize just how bizarre his season has been. Pro Football Focus is a great expected fantasy points model. It looks at how many points we'd expect a player to have based on his workload. And Tony Pollard right now ranks as the RB7 in expected points per game this year. Pollard's playing 4.5 fantasy points per game below expectation. He has 2 touchdowns when based on his usage, he should have closer to 9. Just sit back for a second and imagine a world where we split the difference with just his touchdowns. Then instead of 2 touchdowns, maybe he has 6. So he scored 4 more times than he currently has scored. Remember, his expected touchdown total is 9. So he should have 7 more touchdowns, not 4 more touchdowns. That's 24 more points across the season. That would get him to 15.2 PPR points per game. That would be a low-end RB1 in fantasy football. When people talk about Pollard being this horrible fantasy asset, I get it. I really do. The current result shows that Tony Pollard was a bad pick. But I just don't think enough context is being given to this situation. He's playing way, way below expectation right now. And even if we assume that he doesn't play at expectation, even if we assume that he's just a little bit below expectation, all of a sudden, the narrative shifts completely. Now, I do think that Pollard is playing worse than last year. Numbers show that as well. He's not breaking tackles at the same rate. And maybe that makes Dallas not want to use him that much down the stretch. That's a reason to add Rico Dowdle this week. But because of this schedule upcoming, and because of this regression-related information, I still believe that Tony Pollard is a buy low, with obvious risk. And now you can probably buy him very low. We saw a shift in the Lions' backfield in Week 10. We had both David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs playing, and Gibbs ended up seeing 54% of the team's running back rushes to go along with a 15.6% target share. Montgomery, on the other hand, his running back rush share was 46%, and he didn't see a single target. Now, as my friend Hayden Winks pointed out this week on Twitter, the Lions essentially rotated drives between Montgomery and Gibbs. Gibbs had higher playing time because Montgomery had that huge 75-yard touchdown. So one of his drives was that big play. Even still, I like Gibbs more than Montgomery straight up rest of season because I see him with more receiving upside. And if he can still see some goal line work as he did in Week 10, that's huge. But both players are more than viable. And don't forget, there's contingent upside with both of these guys because the other player can get hurt. Guess what, guys? Marvin Mims finally played a good number of snaps for the Broncos. He ran a route on 73% of Denver's dropbacks on Monday night, which was by far a season high. Unfortunately, he had just a 3.4% target share. He only saw 1 target. This is obviously a good sign for him, though. He can still be a viable stash. If Judy or Sutton go down, he'll be a full-time player. And I'm still a believer in Mims as a talent. He looked pretty good in my prospect model. Guess what else? The Falcons used Bijan Robinson more in Week 10. He saw 65% of Atlanta's running back rushes. That was a little short of a season high. He saw an 11% target share. That's what we've come to expect with Bijan Robinson. The receiving work was never in question. He's seeing a double-digit percentage target share each and every week, basically. Most importantly, though, Robinson saw the lone goal line rush in that offense this week, and he scored on it from the 5. He saw 2 rushes from within the 10. No other Falcons player had a rush within the 10. If he maintains this kind of workload, he can easily be an RB1 in fantasy football coming out of their bye. Something that was good to see in Week 10 was Alvin Kamara getting an uptick in snap share. In Week 8 and Week 9, Kamara had snap shares of just 58% and 49%. In Week 10, it rose again to 76%. Now, Taysom Hill, he had a snap rate of 30%. I think where the Saints have these ultra-negative game scripts, it'll probably mean more Alvin Kamara. But it's good that he was able to at least find the field more in Week 10. Trevor Lawrence has had a very rough season in fantasy football. He's had multiple passing touchdowns in just 2 games, and he's ranked as a top 10 quarterback just twice as well. There's a voice in the back of my head saying to not forget about what happened in 2022, because last year, through 8 games, Lawrence was averaging just a little over 15 points per game. This year, through 9, he's at 13.7. And after those 8 games last year, he really turned it up. He finished the year with 19 points per contest. The issue that I have with this is that number 1, it's probably nothing. But number 2, Jacksonville has the 4th toughest schedule for quarterbacks from here on out in adjusted fantasy points allowed. I don't think it's going to happen for Trevor Lawrence this season. According to FantasyLife.com and their data tools, Diontae Johnson currently ranks 7th in percentage of team air yards. Diontae Johnson, the guy who always has a low average at the target. Not this year. This year, Johnson's ADOT is 12. That's according to Fantasy Life. Across his first 4 seasons in the league, his average ADOT was 9.4. So the Steelers are using him down the field a lot more this year. That might result in a little more variance than usual for him. This past week, he had his lowest PPR output since Week 8 of 2020. But we're probably going to see a higher ceiling from Johnson too. The Denver Broncos defense is playing a lot better. Just look at their last 2 games for proof. In Week 8, Patrick Mahomes finishes the QB 32 against Denver. He had 5.6 fantasy points. Josh Allen in Week 10 scored fewer than 15 fantasy points. He failed to hit 200 passing yards for just the 2nd time this season. The Broncos are not the same matchup that they were to start the year. One player to at least have on your radar is Rondale Moore. I like Michael Wilson's upside in that Arizona offense rest of season, like I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show. But with Kyler Murray back in action against Atlanta this past week, Rondale Moore's target share was 25.8%. That was his 2nd highest target share of the season. Not only that, but Moore saw an ADOT, according to Fantasy Life, of 8.1 on Sunday. That was his 2nd highest average depth of target of the season. He's been around the 3.5 range because he gets targets so close to the line of scrimmage. So don't sleep on Rondale Moore. The final trend this week is about Brock Purdy. I had Purdy as a buy candidate last week. That one's looking good so far. A lot of that recommendation was driven by schedule. San Francisco has the best quarterback schedule from here on out according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. 86% of their matchups are plus matchups according to that metric. And that could be big for Purdy. So far this year, Purdy has played 4 games against teams that rank as top half favorable matchups for quarterbacks. He's played 5 games where the opposite is true. In those 4 games against easier matchups, he's averaged 19.6 points per contest. In the other matchups, he's 3 points per game lower. And in his 2 best matchups this year by that metric, by adjusted fantasy points allowed, he's scored 23.8 and 21.3 points. Brock Purdy is here to stay in fantasy. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.